It's 1781, and a black man walks freely through British military camps, chatting with officers, gathering their secrets, and then he walks right back to the American forces and hands over intelligence that will win the Revolutionary War. But here's the twist that'll blow your mind: this man was legally considered property. His name was James Armistead, and his story is about to change everything you think you know about America's founding. Welcome back to Liberty Unfolded, where we dig deep into the stories they didn't teach you in school. I'm your host, and today we're talking about one of the most incredible figures in American history, a man whose courage and intelligence helped birth a nation, even though that nation didn't consider him free. If you're new here, we explore the real, raw, and often shocking stories of how liberty was truly won in America. And trust me, James Armistead's story has more plot twists than a Netflix series. So buckle up, because we're about to uncover the slave who became a founding father. Let's start with the mind-bending contradiction at the heart of this story. It's 1781, and America is fighting for its independence, declaring that all men are created equal. The Declaration of Independence, written just 5 years earlier, proclaimed these beautiful words about liberty and justice. But James Armistead, he's owned by William Armistead, a Virginia plantation owner who literally owns him like property. Think about that for a second, a man fighting for a country's freedom while having none of his own. This wasn't just some abstract philosophical contradiction. This was James's daily reality. Every morning he woke up knowing that he could be sold, separated from his family, or punished at his master's whim. He had no legal rights, no freedom of movement, no control over his own destiny. Yet somehow, in the midst of this brutal reality, James looked at the American cause and saw something worth fighting for. The Revolutionary War was raging all around Virginia. British forces were sweeping through the South, and the American cause looked desperate. General Washington was struggling to keep his army together. Supplies were running low, and morale was at rock bottom. This was when the Marquis de Lafayette, yes, that Lafayette, the young French general who had crossed an ocean to fight alongside Washington, found himself in desperate need of intelligence about British movements. But here's where James shows us what true patriotism looks like. When Lafayette put out the call for volunteers to spy behind enemy lines, James stepped forward. Not for money, slaves couldn't legally own property anyway. Not for glory, history wasn't going to remember enslaved people as heroes. Not even for the promise of freedom, there were no guarantees that helping the American cause would lead to his emancipation. James volunteered because he believed in something bigger than himself. He looked at the words, "all men are created equal," and somehow saw a future where those words might actually apply to him. Can you imagine that level of faith? That optimism in the face of such overwhelming odds? And let's talk about the courage this required. James knew exactly what he was risking. If you were caught spying as a white soldier, you'd be hanged as a spy a quick, if unpleasant, death. But if you were caught as a black spy, especially an enslaved one, the punishment would be far worse. You'd be tortured as an example to other enslaved people, to show them what happened when you dared to resist. You'd be killed slowly, publicly, brutally. Yet James stepped forward anyway. That's not just courage, that's a level of moral conviction that should humble all of us. Now, here's where this story gets absolutely wild, and where James reveals himself to be not just brave, but brilliantly strategic. James didn't just spy on the British, he convinced them he was spying for them. He walks into British General Cornwallis's camp and basically says, "Hey, I'm a runaway slave and I hate my American masters. I want to help you guys win." The British bought it completely. Why? Because it fit their world, you perfectly. They thought, Of course, this enslaved man would want to help us defeat his oppressors. They had no idea they were looking at one of the most brilliant double agents in military history. But think about what James had to do to pull this off. He had to study British officers, understand their prejudices, and play into their expectations perfectly. He had to appear grateful for their kindness while secretly despising their cause. He had to smile and nod while they talked about crushing the American rebellion, the very rebellion he was risking his life to support. James became so trusted by the British that they gave him access to their most sensitive information. He wasn't just hanging around the camps, he was inside their command structure. British officers would discuss battle plans in front of him, thinking he was just another piece of furniture. They'd send him on errands that took him through their supply lines, past their artillery positions, around their fortifications. The psychological toll this must have taken is staggering. Imagine living every single day knowing that one wrong word, one suspicious glance, one moment of letting your guard down could mean death. Not just your own death, but potentially the deaths of other enslaved people who might be punished for your rebellion. James had to be on. Every single moment, playing a character that was completely opposite to who he really was, and the acting skills required. James had to convince seasoned military officers, men trained to spot deception, that he was genuinely loyal to their cause. He had to ask the right questions without seeming too curious. He had to show interest in their success without appearing to be gathering intelligence. He had to be helpful and useful while secretly sabotaging their efforts. So James is living this incredible double life. By day, he's serving British officers, cleaning their quarters, serving their meals, and listening to their every word. By night, he's memorizing troop movements, battle plans, and supply routes. Then he slips away to pass this intelligence to Lafayette's forces. The level of mental strength this required is staggering. Modern intelligence agencies put their agents through years of training to handle this kind of psychological pressure. James was doing it with no training, no backup, no extraction plan if things went wrong. He was completely on his own, relying on nothing but his wits and his courage. What makes James's story even more remarkable is the spy network he built. He wasn't working alone, he recruited other enslaved people and free black Americans to gather intelligence. Think about it, who had access to British officers' private quarters, who overheard their conversations, who saw their supply wagons and troop movements, the very people the British considered invisible. This is where James's genius really shines through. He understood something that the British military, for all their training and experience, completely missed. The most effective spies are the people you don't even notice. While British officers were watching for suspicious white men who might be American agents, they completely overlooked the black men and women who were serving their food, cleaning their clothes, and managing their camps. James created what modern intelligence agencies would recognize as a sophisticated network. He had sources in British camps, along supply routes, and in occupied towns. Information flowed through this network like water, and James was the central hub, processing and passing along the most crucial intelligence. One of his most important sources was a woman named Sarah, an enslaved cook in British camps. She would signal troop movements by hanging laundry in specific patterns. If British forces were preparing to move north, she'd hang white sheets in a particular way. If they were expecting reinforcements, she'd arrange colored cloth in a different pattern. To anyone watching, she was just doing laundry, but to James, she was providing crucial military intelligence. Another contact was a free black man named Samuel who worked as a guide for British forces, all while reporting their routes to James. Samuel would lead British patrols through the Virginia countryside, memorizing every detail of their strength, their weapons, their morale. Then he'd find ways to pass this information back to James, who would get it to Lafayette's forces. But the network went even deeper. James had contacts among the camp followers, the women who traveled with the British Army, cooking, cleaning, and providing various services. He had sources among the enslaved people who were forced to work on British fortifications, giving him detailed information about defensive positions. He even had contacts among the free black loyalists who had joined the British cause, believing their promises of freedom. Managing this network required incredible skill. James had to coordinate with dozens of people, many of whom couldn't read or write. He had to develop codes and signals that would seem natural to outside observers. He had to create secure ways to pass information that wouldn't be discovered if someone was captured and interrogated. And he had to do all of this while maintaining his own cover as a loyal British supporter. Imagine the complexity. He's pretending to be a British spy while actually being an American spy, all while managing a network of other spies, many of whom don't even know they're part of a larger intelligence operation. The information that flowed through this network was incredibly detailed and accurate. James wasn't just reporting the British are over there. He was providing specific numbers of troops, types of weapons, names of officers, morale assessments, supply levels, and strategic intentions. This was the kind of intelligence that could win or lose battles. Here's where James's intelligence work literally changed the course of history. In 1781, British General Cornwallis was moving his forces toward Yorktown, Virginia. But here's what the British didn't know. James was feeding Lafayette detailed information about their every move. The situation was incredibly tense. The American Revolution was in its 6th year, and both sides were exhausted. The British controlled most of the South, and Cornwallis was confident he could crush the remaining American resistance in Virginia. Washington's Continental Army was barely holding together, and many Americans were ready to give up the fight. But James was about to change everything. As Cornwallis moved toward Yorktown, James was right there with him, still playing his role as a loyal British supporter. He reported that Cornwallis was fortifying Yorktown, expecting reinforcements by sea. He provided exact numbers of troops down to the individual companies and regiments. He drew detailed maps of artillery positions, showing Lafayette exactly where the British cannons were placed and how they were defended. But the most crucial intelligence James provided was about British morale and supplies. He reported that Cornwallis felt trapped and was desperately waiting for the British Navy to evacuate his forces. The British were running low on food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Soldiers were getting sick, and many were deserting. Cornwallis was putting on a brave face, but privately, he was deeply worried about his position. James also provided intelligence about British communications with their navy. He learned that Cornwallis was expecting a massive British fleet to arrive and either evacuate his forces or provide reinforcements for a new offensive. This information was gold to American commanders because it told them exactly when they needed to strike. This intelligence allowed Washington and Lafayette to coordinate perfectly with the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse. When the French Navy arrived and engaged the British fleet in the Battle of the Chesapeake, Washington knew exactly when to move his forces south. When the French Navy won that naval battle and blocked the British escape route by sea, American and French forces were already in position to surround Yorktown by land. The siege of Yorktown was a masterpiece of coordination, and James's intelligence was absolutely central to its success. American and French forces knew exactly where to place their artillery to cause maximum damage. They knew which parts of the British defenses were strongest and which were vulnerable. They knew when British morale was at its lowest and when to press their attacks. But even during the siege, James continued his dangerous work. He provided regular updates on conditions inside Yorktown, letting Allied commanders know how close the British were to breaking. He reported on British attempts to escape, on their food supplies, on their ammunition levels. On October 17, 1781, Cornwallis raised the white flag. 2 days later, on October 19, he formally surrendered. The war was essentially over. British forces marched out of Yorktown as their band played "The World Turned Upside Down." And indeed, the world had turned upside down. And at the surrender ceremony, there was James Armistead, still technically a slave, watching the birth of American independence, an independence he had helped secure through his courage and brilliance. The man who had risked everything for American freedom was witnessing its triumph, even though he himself was still not free. But here's where the story takes a heartbreaking turn. The war is over, America is free, but James, he's still enslaved. The cruel irony is devastating. The man who helped win American liberty had to go back to bondage. Think about the psychological impact of this. James had just spent years risking his life for American independence. He'd seen the British surrender, watched the birth of a new nation founded on the principle that all men are created equal. He'd been praised by Lafayette himself, who called him one of the most valuable assets in the American victory. And then he had to return to slavery. The transition must have been jarring beyond belief. One day, James was a crucial figure in military operations, trusted with secrets that could determine the fate of nations. The next day, he was back to being treated as property, subject to his master's whims, with no legal rights or protections. But James wasn't about to accept this quietly. For years, he petitioned the Virginia legislature for his freedom. He had testimonials from Lafayette himself, praising his essential services and intelligence and fidelity. The Marquis de Lafayette wrote passionate letters on James's behalf, describing how crucial his intelligence had been to American victory. But the wheels of justice turned slowly, especially for a black man in the South. Virginia's legislature was dominated by slaveholders who were terrified of setting precedents that might encourage other enslaved people to expect freedom in exchange for service. They worried that freeing James might inspire others to rebel or demand their own liberty. James faced bureaucratic obstacles that would have broken a lesser man. He had to navigate a legal system that was designed to exclude him. He had to find white allies who would speak for him, since his own testimony carried little weight. He had to prove over and over again that his service had been valuable, even though the evidence was overwhelming. The legal battles were complicated by the fact that James's master, William Armistead, had to consent to his manumission. While William Armistead was generally supportive, he'd allowed James to serve as a spy in the first place. He was also losing valuable property. An enslaved person represented a significant financial investment, and freeing James meant losing that investment entirely. It wasn't until 1787, 6 years after Yorktown, that Virginia finally granted James his freedom. 6 years? Can you imagine waiting 6 years for recognition of service that had helped win a war? 6 years of continued bondage after proving your value to the cause of liberty. And here's the beautiful part. When he became a free man, he took the name James Armistead Lafayette, honoring the general who had recognized his worth and fought for his freedom. This wasn't just about taking a new name, it was about claiming his rightful place in American history. But even then, his struggles weren't over. It took another 40 years of petitioning before Virginia granted him a veteran's pension in 1818. 40 years for a man whose intelligence work was instrumental in winning American independence. White veterans received pensions much more easily, but James had to fight for decades just to get the recognition he deserved. During those 40 years, James lived as a free man, but he never forgot the injustice of his situation. He continued to tell his story, to remind people that the American Revolution had been won by people of all backgrounds, including enslaved people who had believed in liberty even when liberty didn't include them. So what does James Armistead Lafayette's story teach us about liberty and what it means to be a founding father? First, it shows us that the fight for freedom has always been complicated and contradictory. America was founded on the principle that all men are created equal, yet it took nearly a century to extend that principle to all people. James lived that contradiction, but he also helped resolve it by proving through his actions that freedom and patriotism aren't about the color of your skin, they're about the courage in your heart. James's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about our founding. The same men who wrote beautiful words about liberty and equality were often slaveholders themselves. The same revolution that proclaimed universal human rights was built on the labor of enslaved people. But rather than letting these contradictions destroy our faith in American ideals, James's example shows us how to transcend them. He believed in American principles even when America didn't believe in him. He fought for American freedom even when he had no guarantee of sharing in that freedom. He embodied the very ideals that the Founding Fathers proclaimed, even when they failed to live up to those ideals themselves. Second, his story reminds us that the traditional narrative of the Founding Fathers, the white, wealthy, educated men we see in paintings, is incomplete. The real story of American independence includes people like James, the enslaved, the marginalized, the forgotten, who risked everything for an ideal of freedom they weren't even guaranteed to share. When we talk about the Founding Fathers, we usually think of Washington, Jefferson, Adams, Franklin. But James Armistead Lafayette helped found this nation just as much as any of them. He risked his life for American independence, he provided intelligence that won crucial battles, and he spent decades fighting to make American ideals real for all people. The fact that his story was largely forgotten for generations tells us something important about how history gets written. It's usually written by the winners, by the powerful, by those who have the leisure and education to record their experiences. But the real story of America includes millions of people whose contributions were never properly recorded or recognized. Third, James's story is about persistence. He didn't just fight for America's freedom during the war, he spent decades fighting for his own freedom and recognition. That's a lesson for all of us. Liberty isn't something you win once and keep forever. It's something you have to fight for, defend, and expand generation after generation. James never gave up. When Virginia denied his first petition for freedom, he petitioned again. When they denied his request for a pension, he kept fighting. When history seemed to forget his contributions, he kept telling his story. His persistence eventually paid off. He won his freedom. He got his pension, and today his story is finally being told. But his persistence wasn't just about personal recognition. It was about the principle that service to country should be recognized regardless of race. It was about the idea that American liberty should include everyone who fights for it. It was about making the promise of equality real for future generations. James's legacy reminds us that the vision of liberty our founders articulated wasn't just words on parchment. It was a living ideal that people like him were willing to sacrifice everything to achieve. His story shows us that the real test of American principles isn't whether they're perfectly implemented from the beginning, but whether each generation is willing to fight to make them more real, more inclusive, more just. James Armistead Lafayette died in 1832. A free man who had lived to see the country he helped create, grow, and change. His story was largely forgotten for generations, but today there are monuments to him in Virginia, and his name is finally taking its rightful place in American history. His legacy reminds us that the vision of liberty our founders articulated, that all people are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights, wasn't just words on parchment. It was a promise that people like James believed in so deeply They were willing to risk everything to make it real. Today, when we talk about freedom, when we debate what it means to be American, when we struggle with questions of equality and justice, we can look to James Armistead Lafayette as an example of what true patriotism looks like. It's not about blind loyalty to a country, as it's about believing so deeply in what a country could become that you're willing to sacrifice everything to make that vision reality. If James Armistead Lafayette's incredible story moved you, hit that like button and let me know in the comments which part of his story surprised you the most. Were you shocked by his double agent work, amazed by his spy network, or outraged by how long it took for him to get recognition? And if you want to discover more hidden stories of American liberty, the ones they don't teach in textbooks, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell. We're building a community of people who believe that real history is messier, more complicated, and more inspiring than the sanitized version we often hear. Next week, we're diving into another forgotten hero of the Revolution, Crispus Attucks, and the real story of the Boston Massacre. Trust me, it's not what you think. Until then, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember, liberty isn't something that happens to you. It's something you make happen. James Armistead Lafayette proved that, and his story continues to inspire us today. See you next week, and remember, the truth about liberty is still unfolding.